mistakes. So there you can see, right? In case of user-defined functions, another one is using history.replace in render instead of redirect component, missing mistakes in detail. For that, let's take an e-commerce example. Okay, so here the first one is when we are defining functions, when there are some user-defined functions, they have to be in arrow function syntax. Okay, if we write them, let's say, in a function definition syntax, so then we will actually encounter an error. Okay, let's understand why. So here you can see on change username is a function that we have defined, right? So it's a user defined function. So when it comes to the user defined function, so if you write it in a function definition syntax as we have written it here, so then the function will be run in the browser context, right? So when a function runs in a browser context, this variable will have null value. And if you're writing this dot set state, or if you're accessing this dot state or something like this, so this variable will be having the value null. So null dot some property will obviously throw an error. There you can see. Okay, so when a function is run in a browser context, this variable will be having null. And when you define a function using a function definition syntax, then it will run in a browser context. This will have null value, and you cannot access dot set state, dot state, and all of these things. Okay, so what do we have to do? Whenever we are writing user defined functions, we have to write them using arrow function syntax. So in our case, you can see that on change username was previously written in function definition syntax. We have to write that in a arrow function syntax. There you can see, right? So now you will get the appropriate output and there is no error. Okay, so now coming to the component lifecycle methods, that is component did mount, render, component will unmount, these methods. Okay, these are the methods that are extended from the React component. Okay, so these can be written in the function definition syntax because already they run in the React context. Since they're extended from the React component, they run in the React context. So that's the reason in this variable we'll have that React context. So that won't be an issue. So in case of component lifecycle methods, we can write them in the function definition syntax. There is no need of writing in arrow function syntax. Okay, whereas in case of user defined functions like on change username, on click, all these things, so these have to be written using the arrow function syntax. So in case of component lifecycle methods, there is no need, but whereas in case of user defined functions, you have to make use of the arrow function syntax. And we understood the reason, because it will be run, the context in which it will be run will matter. Okay, clear? Now let's proceed further to the next mistake. So the next possible mistake is using redirect component in callbacks or event listeners. Okay, let's understand about this. So here you can see that when we are clicking on logout button, so we want to redirect to the login, right? So this is what we want to achieve. So here for this, we have used the redirect component. We are returning the redirect component. Okay, this is what we are doing. So this will actually throw an error because the redirect component returns a JSX. So which has to be used to render the UI, right? Whereas, so here what do we want to do? Okay, generally in the render method is used to return a JSX element and display in the UI. Whereas here, redirect component is returning a JSX element, right? So it shouldn't be used in the event handlers because in event handlers, we want something to get executed, right? So it won't return, event handler won't return something which has to be rendered. Whereas in the render method, we have to return the JSX element to be rendered, right? So there is a difference here. So in case of event handlers, we shouldn't make use of the redirect component because redirect will return a JSX element. So basically here on click logout is returning JSX element that needs to be rendered. But actually on click logout is a function that needs to be called, right? It's not returning something. It shouldn't return something, right? So that's the issue here. So basically redirect component is returning JSX that needs to be rendered. Whereas, so here this is an event handler, right? Inside the event handler, we shouldn't use redirect component since it returns a JSX element. So what do we have to do? We have to make use of the history, right? As we previously understood about the history, we have to make use of history and write history.replace. So what will this do, right? Automatically the history will be replaced and appropriately the component corresponding to that path will be rendered. So in case of event handlers, callbacks, we have to make use of the history object. If you want to navigate to a particular specific route in event handlers or callbacks, you have to make use of the history object. Okay, that is very, very important, right? Because redirect component will return a JSX element that needs to be rendered. Whereas in case of the history object, it will directly navigate to that route. Okay, that's the advantage here. Okay, you can see the output now appropriately. So when we are logging out, so it's appropriately got navigated to the /login and we are able to see the login component being displayed. Okay, so here we understood that we shouldn't use the redirect component in callbacks or event listeners. We have to make use of the history. Okay, Now, the next thing is using history.replace in render method instead of redirect component. Okay, so here you can see in the render method, we have made use of history.replace. See, the history prop should be used in event handlers or callbacks to navigate to specific routes. In the render method, we have to make use of the redirect component because redirect component will return a JSX element that needs to be rendered. Since inside the render, we are expecting to return a JSX element to be rendered, we have to make use of the redirect element. There you can see. So it's very, very clear. So in case of event handlers and callbacks, you have to make use of history. In case of render, you have to make use of redirect. Okay, because redirect will return JSX. In render, we have to return JSX, so we'll make use of redirect. In event handlers and callbacks, so there we just have an action to be performed. So in that case, we have to use the history. Okay, clear? So whenever we want to achieve navigation, it's very, very clear now, right? So in case it's event handlers or callbacks, if you're trying to navigate in event handlers or callbacks, you have to use history. Okay, and in case if you want to navigate in a render method, right, in such scenarios, you have to make use of the redirect component. I hope this part is clear. Okay, there you can see the updated output appropriately. Okay, there you can see. So we have slash and then login, and then appropriately we got redirected to the slash. Okay, clear? So coming to the next possible mistake, which is missing with router to have history prop. Okay, let's understand this. So here you can see that we have the header component, and within the header, you can see we have written history.replace of slash login. Okay, so here you can see that if you write like this, we'll get an error saying cannot read property replace of undefined. Let's understand the reason behind it. As we previously understood, when it comes to the history prop, so the history prop will only be available for the route components. So the route components will only have the history prop. Okay, whereas here, if you take the header is not a route component, right? So here you can see. So header is not a route component. So header will not have the history prop. And if you try to access history.replace, you will get an error saying cannot read property replace. So the reason is, so the history prop will be only available for the route components. Now, let's say we want to access the history prop. We want to use it in other components, other route, non-route components. So in such scenarios, we have to wrap it with router. There you can see, right? We have to wrap it with router. There you can see. So if you don't do this, then the history prop will not be available and you'll not be able to use history.replace, right? We previously understood about this. So in case if you haven't written the with router for the header, so then you will get an error of this kind saying that cannot read property replace. So then you need to understand that we forgot to mention with router, and once you mention that, it will appropriately work. Okay, clear? So when you're using the history prop, you have to check whether it's a route component or not. If it's a route component, then the history prop will be available. If it is not a route component, then you have to make use of with router. Only then you will be able to access the history prop. Okay, clear? So we are done with this set of common mistakes. So we understood that. So when we are defining a function, we have to make use of arrow function syntax. In case of component lifecycle methods, so there is no need of writing an arrow function syntax. You can directly write it in function definition. The next thing that we understood is, so in case of callbacks and event listeners, we have to make use of history, not the redirect component. And in case of render, we have to make use of history. We have to make use of the redirect component, not the history, right? Because redirect component returns JSX. In render, we have to return JSX. So we make use of the redirect. And in case of callbacks and event listeners, we make use of the history, right? Then we also understood that when we are trying to access the history prop, so if the component is not a route component, then we have to use with router. Only then we'll be able to access the history prop. Okay. Now let's look at the next set of common mistakes. That is providing wrong object keys for the request. And then the next thing is not updating the state when required. Let's understand each of these. The first thing is providing the request object keys incorrect. Okay, let's understand this. Okay, so here you can see that we have an expected request object. So where we have the username and password as the keys that we have to pass. Okay, whereas when it comes to our JS code, there you can see that in the React.js, in the state we have username, okay, where the N is capital, and then we are accessing that from the state and we are providing that in the user details object, and we are finally passing that, there you can see JSON.stringify. So here you can see that there is a difference here. So in the expected request object, we want the username with the N as smaller case, right? Whereas when the user details object that we are packing, right? So there the N is capital, right? Whereas here we want it in small, right? So there is a mismatch here. So there is a very high chance that such a thing happens. So in such scenarios, so the API call will fail because we are not providing the expected request object, right? There you can see. So if you are trying to provide that and we are trying to log it, so then the API call will fail. There you can see here, we got 400, which means that at the things that we are passing from the client, there is an issue with that, right? Okay, so here the issue is basically, so the username that we are providing, so there the N should be small. So we have appropriately updated and now the API call is successful. Okay, there you can see the API call being successful. So when you're providing the request object, you have to be careful about what is the expected request object and whether you're sending it appropriately or not. It could be spelling mistakes or capital, lowercase, uppercase issues like this. Okay, you need to be careful about that. Okay. Now, the next thing is not updating the state when required. Okay, let's understand about this. So here we have taken the login form example. So here you can see in the state there are two keys. One is a show submit error. Another one is the error message. Okay, when the submit has failed. Okay, so we are setting the state with the appropriate error message. But we are not updating the show submit error. There you can see, right? We have to update the show submit error as true. And we are not updating that in the state when there is a failure. We are only updating the error message. Then what will happen? Obviously, the show submit error will not be displayed because only when the show submit error is true, we are displaying the error message. So there you can see, even when the API call has failed, when there is an error in the submission, right? So the submit is not, the error is not being displayed because the show submit error has not been updated to true. Okay, so you might have encountered these errors. So when we have to update the state, you have to check for all the keys that have to be updated and ensure that they are being updated at the position where they have to be updated. So here in our case, so the show submit error has to be updated as true. Since it's not updated, we are not getting the expected output. So now we have updated it as true, and there you can see the result. Okay. Clear? So these are the another set of common mistakes that we have covered. So we understood that we have to cross-check the expected request object and the object that we are passing.